I am Eward, Vice President of Fraud Engineering at ThreatFabric, and today I am in Canary Wharf in London to speak to Craig Rice, the CEO at the Cyber Defense Alliance. Craig is a veteran in cybersecurity, infosec, finance, payments, both in the financial and the public sector, and I bet he has a few interesting stories to share about the fraud landscape in the UK.
Craig, I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and before 2014, it was remarkably blank. So what gives?
I did nothing until 2014. I just arrived on the planet.
I know for a fact that's not true.
So I spent quite a bit of time in the UK military. I was in the British Army, in the intelligence function in the British Army, and I had a lovely time. I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic fun. But my eldest daughter, was born a month after I left. So you can see that my priorities were to make sure that I was a present father in my children's lives rather than off gallivanting on adventures and leaving my wife to cope with all the problems and all the challenges of bringing up two young children. So I didn't want that life.
What's that like if you spend your life in the military? Obviously, you've probably seen a lot of stuff, including a lot of stuff you cannot talk about at all. And then suddenly you're a civilian, you're transitioning into civilian life. What's that like?
It's really interesting. There's a quite a lively thread on the challenges of transition, regardless of nation, from military personnel into civilian life. You know, you're taught very specifically in the military that you are a component of a machine and that the kudos of the role is not yours. It's something that you borrow from previous generations, and that your rank is not just a mark of your status, it's a mark of your responsibility and accountability and your duty to others. And there's a very specific set of values that you live by. And of course, there's people that don't live by those values, but mostly because it is a hierarchical and regimented structure, people do live by those values and do buy into those values. And of course, every corporate has those values, and you know they're in the lobbies of every corporate headquarters that you'll get to walk through, but they're not, in my experience, as lived and as breathed as military values are. And I think a lot of veterans, regardless of their nationality, and I've spoken to US veterans and Dutch veterans, they find that transition somewhat disconcerting because not everybody plays by the same rules and not everybody is a team player. And one of my friends who's very successful in the UK, he's been a partner of two of the big four organisations and is now a very senior government position. He very politely put it that I think veterans do challenge in an environment isn't team orientated and you're not valued as a team member. So I think I don't think you ever fully transition. I don't think you ever get to be a normal person again, because the military leaves an indelible mark on you, even if you serve for a brief period of time. But the opportunities that open up to make an impact as an individual rather than as a rank or a component of a military unit are equally as enticing as some of the difficulties you have to overcome to your new environment and your new set of values and standards when you leave the military. But I had a fantastic time. I really enjoyed it. I had some success in my military career. And it's, you know, I'm really pleased on the eve of the UK general election to see some really talented military veterans, some of whom I served with and knew, bring that sense of service and, you know, public service in particular to the UK political scene. I think that's a really positive dimension that people who believe in the servant leader model are choosing to serve their country as politicians, because if CISO is a tough job, then politicians is way up there as an even harder job, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah, right. I think everyone knows when looking at the news that there are some egos there, and there's also people who serve because they believe in that way of fulfilling their lives, if you will. Yeah. And then is that serving? Because in my mind, when you transitioned into finance, right, you still had that desire to serve in some way.
So my wife is a corporate banker, and she's a very clever lady indeed. And when I was going for my first civilian job, there were two options available to me. One was to work in a cyber threat intelligence role in a very large multinational, and one was where we met in what was the Payments Council at the time, that became Payments UK, which is a sort of a member organisation at the centre of financial services. And my wife said, take the payments job. And I said, well, why? It's much less money than the corporate job. And she said, you will learn more being at the centre of that hub and meet more interesting people than you will working for a big corporate in the basement. And of course, she was right, you know. Yeah. Again.
Yeah. That's true. And so we did meet back in the early 2010s, right?
Yeah.
That was the first time we met.
Yeah. So I think it was literally months after I left the military. I met you in about October 2014. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember well. So, but tell us a little bit about that time. It's not about me, it's about you. Payments UK. What did you do there?
So initially, I was employed as the head of security there to articulate the challenges that the membership of Payments UK, or Payments Council as it was then, which were 42 clearing banks connected to the BACS and faster payments, check and credit clearance, and PayM systems. So basically the retail payment system of the UK economy, and basically the critical national infrastructure of the financial services. Other organisations will be systemically important financial institutions, but the plumbing, as it were, the payment system that hold it all together are tier one critical national infrastructure. And I came from an operational resilience background. Some of the work I did in the UK meant I had a clear understanding of both how to defend and attack critical national infrastructure, and that was quite interesting work. But I was given a research project to do about, write a proper strategy paper on going forward. And I wrote a long paper, perhaps too long in hindsight, but I wrote a long paper with some very interesting collaborators, both in industry and in the Bank of England, many of whom were disavowed because they wanted to keep their inputs below the surface. But basically, the hypothesis was we're reaching the end of the technology-led, target-centric approach, network-centric approach, and beginning the target-centric, intelligence-led approach. And I had high hopes that cyber threat intelligence would reach a level of acuity where we could have a physical effect on the threats facing us. And I think that promise has taken a long time to deliver. And in many ways, the value of cyber threat intelligence has been much harder to realise than I thought it was going to be back in 2014 when I wrote that paper, published that paper in March 2014.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe, controversially, I think zero trust actually is a good conceptual model to develop the next phase of information security in a digital age. And I classify that in four phases. We've had computer security, which was mainframe to mainframe through bespoke ducting. Then it was IT security. Hey, this internet thing looks pretty good. Let's use that and connect everything to that. And we used technology to defend against technology. Then we got into cybersecurity, was like, well, hang on a minute. There's these bad guys that are doing stuff. We should probably know about them. And we should probably train our people not to fall for the tactics of the bad guys. And all three of those were based on the view that with enough investment, we can deter or defeat all attacks. The age of cyber resilience that we're now in is that, I know what we said earlier, but we've now shown that we can't do that. And at some point we're going to go down. It might be a cyber extinction event, a 0-day event, but we're going to have an outage. So what's your plan to recover and rebuild? And I think going forward, what that proves is the defense in depth model has reached the limits of its exploitation. It works for commoditized threats. It's easy to measure, and therefore second and third line find it very easy to articulate when there are what they consider, in their opinions, a deviation from optimal performance. But conceptually, it's almost in the absence of a better idea that we're continuing with the defense in depth model rather than embracing the challenges of zero trust and doing that peripherally by getting a CASB or a VPN and saying, I'm done, zero trust is here. And
Yep.
And maybe that's the problem, that some of the investment in industry is face value and the urgent overtakes the important and nothing gets done to the thoroughness and the depth that perhaps we would like. And that's a factor of digital economies moving very fast, divestments, mergers and acquisitions, changing product lines, moving with the market, and the ability of security to match the agility and pace of that operational processes.
Yeah.
But maybe that's sometimes that as professionals, we haven't got the depth of understanding of the threat environment that we perhaps should have.
That's interesting, because you've been in this, in the finance space in a very central roles in multiple organizations. I would love to ask you a few things about that later. But how have you seen the finance and payments in relation to cybersecurity, fraud and scams change over the last 10 years?
I think the benefit of being in a regulated industry is that you are held to account in a way that non-regulated industries are not. Personally, I feel the CBEST program, which doesn't stand for Cyber Bank of England Systematic Testing, because you're not allowed to use the Bank of England name in a product. But if it did, that would be a good name for it, which of course launched TIBA and the series of red teaming exercises that regulators now run to simulate the ability of an organization to defend itself. So cyber questionnaires were useful, but they were always compared to me to being the questionnaire you fill out before you have your medical with the doctor. And then actually when you have the medical with the doctor and he says, well, it says here you exercise all the time. Just talk me through what you actually do. And it says here you only have one drink a week. How big is that drink? And I think what red team testing does is it brings out your cyber questionnaire in a very narrow sort of arc, as it were, a very laser light shone into the darkness as opposed to the searchlight, which is the questionnaire. But it makes the cumulative return of your efforts real. Are you actually able to simulate an effective defense against a determined, sophisticated, severe threat?
Yeah.
And I think that was a turning point in how we in financial services thought about the effectiveness of our defenses. And whilst there'll always be subjectivity in any activity like ours, and I think cyber, controversially, is a threat management discipline in a risk management culture. So not a lot of people subscribe to that view, but I think that explains why some of the dysfunctional conversations are happening between executives and boards about why haven't you solved this problem yet? Because we are unable to articulate the nuances of that threat management versus risk management. Yeah. So I do think financial services has moved forward a great deal. I think they've made progress. I think that expertise is beginning to move out into other sectors. I think the change in the threat environment has accelerated the requirement for a genuine defense. And I think some of the high-profile outages that we're seeing in our health service, in the Irish health service, are making our digital societies feel that this is an important subject that needs a lot of focus. But we have to balance that with organizations exist to make money and to serve their customers, and we exist to protect those processes and contest the operational space we need with those adversaries who are trying to cut us off from those markets. And We've seen signs of that.
Right.
So there's a balance to what resources will be given to do it. Yeah. And therefore, organizations like the Payments UK, the Payments Council as it was, UK finance, and indeed ourselves, that offer members a collective mechanism to achieve a common end, have value, I think, will have more value as the threat environment becomes more turbulent and more contested in the future.
There was so much to unpack in what you just said about threat management in a risk management environment. But also, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, do you think that, for example, Tiber and were the regulations prescribing operational methods to banks, were they important, or would the collective industry, would they have gotten here without the regulations as well?
That is a fascinating question. I think the difference between prescriptive legislation and principles-based legislation is really important. And there are security standards that exist that are very prescriptive in nature. And you almost feel as though that's moving the liability from the person that issued that security standard to you, the organization. And that's prevalent in the payments world. I think things like the cybersecurity framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, that offers a principles-based framework to evaluate capability, that seems to me to be more flexible and appropriate to a turbulent task environment. In other words, you don't know where the next threat is coming from. So what of that is the energy and the expertise required to intelligently assess the opportunity cost of the least worst decision, because there are no good decisions, they're just least worst decisions. Yeah. And what I mean by that, if you're successful, the attack is deterred or defeated, nobody knows. So your successes aren't celebrated. And if you're unsuccessful, there's a massive outage and you start looking for a new job.
The prevention paradox, some call it.
Prevention paradox, that's a great way of describing it. Yeah.
We haven't had any breaches. No, we know.
Well, of course, the other paradox there is, of course, being ignorant of the threats you're facing and saying that my investments are entirely appropriate to the threats I face because I have made no effort to understand the threats I face.
Right.
You know, so that maybe that's the emu paradox, you know, the head in the sand approach.
Yeah, lack of visibility goes a long way in preventing threats as well. Yeah.
But I do think in the past I've worked very closely with regulators, and I've really enjoyed the intellectual curiosity and the investment that a non-technical regulator will put into understanding the technical specifics of the challenges that the information security world faces. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule. And sometimes legislation can just be a check sheet that somebody's working through. And similarly, we have to look critically at the 3 lines of defense model and say, is internal audit always considering the opportunity cost of their opinions? And is the risk function fully understanding where that risk comes from, or considering that risk in isolation?
Yeah. Whatever happened over the 10 years? So you mentioned the better understanding, the better operationalizing of implementing those threat management within a risk management model within the financial industry, within the banks, happened over time and improved as well. Is that also the reason why you transitioned from UK Payments to being the CEO of the Cyber Defense Alliance over time?
Gosh, that I think you never know where your career is going, but other people will look at you in a way that perhaps you might not look at yourself, and see opportunities for you that you don't see for yourself. So I think I arrived here because I was approached by the board to consider this role. And I said, thank you very much, but I don't think it's for me. I had a preconceived idea of what the Alliance was and what they did, and I didn't think I'd be able to perhaps add the value that I wanted to, or take it in the direction I want. And then they came back and said, again, we really think you should look at this. And I said, I'm really not sure about this. And then the third time they said, just send your CV and just stop mucking about. And the people that approached me with that, I really trust and respected. And I thought to myself, why am I not? Why am I allowing my preconceptions to get in the way of what could be an opportunity? then I met my predecessor, who is an incredibly charismatic and energetic man who lived by a set of values. He's a former senior police officer who was in Europol for many years, who had a real sense of mission. And I heard about the team, and I thought, this is an organisation that could really, do the bad guys some serious damage and really add value to a much broader community than any single organisation. So I have embraced that challenge, and it has been so far it's been a fantastic decision, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I work alongside some very talented, very high-minded individuals with that sense of mission and purpose that is really difficult to replicate and synthesize if it isn't real. I think organizations put a lot of time and effort to try and give their teams and their staff that sense of purpose and bigger ideals, but sometimes that's really difficult to manufacture.
Well, I've had the pleasure to see you enjoy your new role. And when you presented on the CDA event, actually here in this same building, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed.
And you were wearing sunglasses, not just because you wanted to look cool, but also because the sun was very bright.
It was a really hot room.
It was a hot room in a hot day, but you managed to keep everyone awake. So yeah, that was amazing. And one of the things I'm curious about is in your new role in the CDA. Obviously, how many members do you have?
So at the moment, we're about 14, but we're growing steadily. And it's really interesting if you were to look at who our members were. You'd say, well, what's the systematic approach here? And honestly, there isn't one. What tends to happen is we find intelligence that a particular institution is having a really tough time. We get that intelligence to that institution as quickly as possible and say, we can help you out here, here, and here. And sometimes that conversation begins and ends there. They say, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Didn't know you guys existed, but that's really helpful. And then, perhaps a month later, they'll say, it's us again about that stuff you found for us. Can you do that for us again? I said, yeah, we can. So we haven't heard of you. How do we get involved with you? And that's how we grow organically, literally by demonstrating our capability. And over 10 years of operations, 9 of which are in as a separate legal entity, as a separate corporation, I think the CDA has evolved to a space where it's delivering what other organizations can't. And it's actually having a disruptive effect. And we extremely value our partnerships with Europol, with the City of London Police, with Metropolitan Police, and with the National Crime Agency, as well as with the Guard and the National Cybersecurity Centre, both here and in Ireland. Those are really important partnerships. And I think the definition of public-private partnership has changed considerably in those 10 years to be much more balanced than it was in the past, where arguably it was just providing information to the public sector who wouldn't perhaps tell you how they pursued or invested in it. Now we're seeing much more appetite to work in coordination and do what we do, which is turn threat intelligence into a target intelligence, isolating a target in time and space, and then turning that target intelligence to a target pack, working with law enforcement or other agencies over a protracted period of time to build up a detailed scheme of maneuver to strike targets simultaneously and maximize the impact on a threat network or a threat forum, and to effectively atomize that network. That does two things. That drives up the barriers of entry to new entrants into the market by taking out these threat forums. And it puts mistrust and doubt into highly effective, organized threat networks that strike us. And to the point that you discussed earlier, some of those ostensibly are criminals, but not every person on a criminal forum is a criminal actor. We're seeing geopolitical threat actors in a process that I describe as threat compression come together using social media forums and dark web forums to leverage criminal actors on their behalf to pursue geopolitical events. And we've seen open media reporting about that, open source reporting about that in the UK quite extensively.
Yeah, because back in April, I remember when you were wearing those sunglasses, you were very sad because you said, well, I have a big secret. I wish I could tell you, but there's an embargo until 12 tonight.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the next morning, you were able, it got very big in the news. I think every outlet, it reported on that. And you later on, actually, you shared with me that it was called Operation Stargrew.
That's right.
And I think that is one of the great examples of what you just said, right? Is the collaboration between public and private here.
Exactly so. And that was our second biggest operation that we'd done. We did one 2 years previously called Opelabra against the iSpoof platform that resulted in 180 arrests throughout the world. This one was, I think, about 40 arrests globally. Now, that's not necessarily a barometer of less success. That reflects a change in the scheme of maneuver. So what we learned from that first operation, that was that mass disruption, kind of creates an inertia in the criminal justice system because they're dealing with 180 cases. By isolating the high-value targets, we'll arrest those, but we can disrupt other threat actors on there by undermining their confidence. There's a fantastic video produced by the Metropolitan Police, which a famous technology journalist in the UK calls Smart Digital Policing, which was sending each of the threat actors a detailed breakdown in an animated cartoon of the activity they'd been working on and who they'd been targeting. Can you imagine, sitting in your home, what you feel if your laptop, you receive that to your laptop, you'd be looking left and right thinking, oh, crikey, does this mean I'm next? And it does, effectively. It means that we're queuing up those targets for future exploitation.
Yeah. What kind of criminals are they? What kind of criminal are we talking about?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because we've got to the point that we've been so ineffective in that space that people are sometimes leaving university and deciding that to be a cyber threat actor, a con man, a fraudster, a scammer is their career of choice. And one of our members shared a voice recording of us, of somebody's trying to socially engineer a small organisation. And in the end, this chap got his way to the financial director of this company. But the financial director was a seasoned old campaigner and sniffed him out really early in the conversation, but kept the conversation flowing. And during this conversation, the threat actor was eventually challenged and said, so tell me how you do this scamming, this spoofing then. And he reacted explosively, really rudely, and, was very Anglo-Saxon in his language, to say the least. But once he calmed down, he explained that, he'd just left university and he and his mates moved out to the Middle East and were living in Dubai. They were making 7-figure salaries and this was what their preferred career option. Well, that's a terrible testament, not just to the effectiveness of what we do, but as an indictment of us as a society where our brightest and the best that we put through university decide that they'll adopt a criminal modus operandi right from the beginning of their careers. And if it's happening in the UK, you can guarantee it's happening in other European countries. And of course, you've got those that migrate from the criminal world, from high-risk criminal enterprises into cybercrime because they see the value of it and the low opportunity cost.
Yeah,
I think organisations like the CDA, working in partnership with Europol and national police forces, we're changing that balance. We are going to make that much more difficult for people, and threat actors and threat networks, and we are going to hold people to account for what they do. This isn't, white-collar crime with no consequence. This has a really corrosive effect, not just on industry and commerce, but on the very digital democracies, because it breaks the barriers of trust. And once you break those barriers of trust, you become polarized in those communities that say what you regard as right. And we end up with this sort of loss of the middle ground as people move left and right to the extreme views. Yeah. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of European countries, and arguably some North American countries as well.
Yeah. So how much do you feel as CDA you have a responsibility not just to your members, but to society as they are, let's say, the customers of your members?
So first and foremost, our purpose is to protect the members, their clients, their customers, and the societies they serve. And that is written into our constitution as a company, is that we will not walk past harm to any society where our members are active. We have members in Ireland, we have members in Germany, we have members in Spain, we have members in the UK. So we operate, we also have members in North America. So we operate across the Northern Hemisphere, and we will not walk past where people could be harmed by that. We will take action to protect victims. And the interesting thing about Operation Stargrew is that 400,000 credit card numbers were recovered, and most of those hadn't yet been used. 1.2 million passwords were recovered. Most of those hadn't been used. So we're almost in that sort of Tom Cruise Minority Report space where future crime is about to happen. We're getting ahead of those offences where people can be harmed. And that psychological damage and dislocation that people have from losing their identity, from losing control of their financial processes, we are able to get ahead of that by these disruption operations. Yeah. So my aim is, how do I increase the capacity and the tempo of those operations going forward? How do I demonstrate that value as one of the few organizations able to build those target packs? Because
that's interesting. So the disruption is just as much a goal of the operation as is just information sharing. And
yeah, so we have three main aims to our strategy: identify, target, and disrupt. And identify threats to our members and their clients before they are able to be activated, so that their security posture at a corporate level can be adjusted to deal with that vulnerability, that threat coming in to their members by warning people that their details are compromised, so counter-compromise action can be taken. So that's identify. Target is very much, okay, you've identified the problem, but where did that come from? Remember, cyber is a threat management discipline in a risk management culture. We've dealt to the risks to the organization and the customer, but that doesn't deal with the upstream problem, because that threat actor can generate another risk tomorrow and another risk tomorrow. So rather than run around just playing whack-a-mole, we'll play a bit of whack-a-mole, but we'll go after the threat actor as well and say, how can we isolate you in time and space, assess the damage you're doing, and then prioritize you for targeting and disruption operations. Mm-hmm. And that disrupt piece, we don't do any disruption ourselves. We work as the junior partner to law enforcement and other agencies who have that legal and regulatory power to do that disruption action. Mm-hmm. And we should recognize that threat compression effect, where ideological and geopolitical actors are using criminal forums, sometimes means that deconfliction of targeting is best dealt with by those with a much richer intelligence picture than we can provide from private corporate networks alone. Yeah. So it's a real synchromesh of public and private intelligence coming together.
So in that action, you managed to prevent a lot of misery from happening, like you mentioned, like the Tom Cruise movie, the future crime you help prevent. And these are people that will probably never know that you prevented a lot of misery from happening to them.
I hope so. And that's, it's the prevention paradox in another perspective, isn't it? Almost all of us are targeted at one point or another. I don't think people appreciate how much work and effort the banking industry, the financial services industry, put into defending their clients and their customers' equities and interests. The banks are on the front line and they know it, and they invest accordingly. And there's some very talented, very driven, mission-orientated people that work in those roles against as demanding operational tempos as I've seen in the military in some cases. When an incident happens, it's not unusual for cybersecurity staff in a financial institution to find themselves working 12, 18-hour shifts for days and weeks on end. My neighbour was the CISO of Maersk in NotPetya, I didn't see him for 2 weeks. He lived in Maidenhead, sometimes under his desk, and sometimes he was lucky he got a hotel bed for 4 hours.
Yeah.
I think that level of dedication is perhaps, a significant factor in the type of people that seek to have a career in cyber.
Yeah. I think Maersk estimated the damages to something like 800 million, their estimate. And but also it was one of the first big examples what happened when a nation state takes up, let's say, a piece of software out of the criminal domain, and kind of messes it up.
Cyber extinction events, 0 days like that. It's disguised as ransomware, but it's not. It's a cyber payload. It's a warhead that's been fired into the system. And I personally think WannaCry was a bit of a mission rehearsal, a bit of a trial. What's the splash going to be from this? What's the collateral damage going to be from this? Okay, we can tolerate that. Fine. Launch the main warhead and let's see. Because it was targeted at the Ukrainian tax collection revenue service through the MEDOC small application, where the single point of failure in the taxation process was you must submit through the MEDOC application. Well, okay, that's the one place I'll target then. And what people forget about, NotPetya, is everybody talks about Maersk in relation to it, but there was over 230 organizations hit there, including a company that made HIV vaccines and other pharmaceutical roles. And lots of people suffered a lot of pain. I personally would put the damage in the billions. And it was an act of cyber warfare, I guess in legal terms, I have to be careful about that because the insurance industry might use that in a different way.
Exactly, be very careful there. It was a ransomware attack for all practical purposes.
Let's call it that.
Let's call it that. So how do you feel fraud and scams play a role into, let's say, geopolitical conflict?
Well, I think obviously there are such a large threat, and I think it's 40% of crime in the UK now is of a fraudulent nature. That's in physical fraud as well as cyber fraud. We deal with cyber fraud. We are a cyber defense alliance. So we are, fighting those threat actors, relentlessly fighting those threat actors in that cyber domain. The vast majority of those will be what we used to call, in my time in other counter-terrorist environments, ODC, ordinary decent crime. They don't have a subversive or malicious intent other than their criminal, subversive and malicious intent. But we have seen some activity that has made me raise an eyebrow. We saw a very brief DDoS that was very weak and very brief and against a target that's known to have good DDoS defenses. And that made me raise an eyebrow. And almost in my mind, I was playing out a conversation where a chap from Dzerzhinsky Square comes along to a Russian OCG and says, we need you to attack this British bank because the Brits are making our life difficult. So I want you to DDoS it. And they're like, oh, thanks very much, but I'm making a lot of money here. And if I do that, I'm not going to make any money for the day. So, well, you need to do it. Otherwise, it's the Ukraine for you, Sonny Jim. So they go, okay, then we'll get on with that and do a DDoS attack. And they say, oh, we tried, but they defeated it, very quickly. Well, okay, good job. Support the motherland. Support the effort. We'll be back for the next favor whenever. And I think plausible deniability, false flag operations, call them what you will, using criminal entities is a way of projecting a lot more capability than perhaps intelligence agencies, particularly hostile intelligence agencies, can project on their own. So I think, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it isn't always a duck, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot today. One thing I want to know is, I want to know two things. First of all, do you ever have any regrets following your wife's advice?
Never regret taking your wife's advice would be my marital advice to everybody on the call. I think, no, she was right. It made the right decision. I think regrets are, what happens, and you can't predict what is always going to happen in your life. But you can only you can only control how you react to those events. And I have been stupendously lucky. I've worked with some amazing people in the 10 years that I left, and I've worked for some outstanding people in the time I was in the military. Some people now have gone on to bigger and greater things. The opportunity to make a contribution, the opportunity to lead, to be a influence in people's lives, it is a privilege in the purest sense of the word. You have to earn that privilege every single day. You have to think about how you're helping those people develop, how you're thinking, helping them create opportunities for them, and how you're moving your organization forward. And I think that's the challenge of my role. You know, I'm not in the cybersecurity business anymore. I'm in the leadership business as a chief executive, albeit of a very small company. And the expectation of my people is that they can expect my focus on their welfare, on their benefit, as well as the benefit of the organization. And if they can't expect that, then I'm not doing my job. So yes, she was right. And no, I don't regret it.
I wouldn't expect anything else but that answer. If you know what's good for you.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So what's next? What will we see next from you and the CDA?
I think we've reached a level of operational maturity that surpasses what most people can achieve in this field. We now have 2 strategic operations to our credit, and dozens and dozens of tactical operations that we don't talk about, we don't brag about, and that's quite right, and we're in that space. I think we're moving into a threat period now where our services and support has never been more required. We are talking to people in other sectors that say, how can you help us? We're talking to people in the EU who want our support, and talking to people further afield, right to the fringes of the eastern side of the EU. I think people recognise the value that the skill set brings. I'd like to see us make a better contribution, a bigger contribution to the disruptive effect that we're having. I think we, as a collective, do need to take disrupt more seriously than we have. We've kind of said, well, that's somebody else's business, that's law enforcement and government's job. I'm busy defending my estate. And I think the lesson of cyber resilience is that doesn't work. You know, no man is an island and no organisation is an island, and we're all interconnected, and we need to work in an alliance, and what's more, an alliance of action, not just a talking shop, to turn that knowledge and expertise that we have into impact against the threats that are hitting us. And that's my plan.
Well, I think Europe is a better place for that. And I've been working with you for well over 10 years now.
It is now, isn't it? Yeah.
And I look forward to the next 10 years. So thank you very much that you wanted to have this conversation with me, Craig.
It's a pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.